Welcome to the virtual annual Forage Field Day. My name is Josh Mickle. I'm a field agronomist with Iowa State Extension and Outreach, and I'd like to welcome you to our virtual field day and forage plot tour. Today, we'll be highlighting some research and sharing data looking at different cool season annual forage species, their nutritional value, and yield potential. There continues to be an increased interest in the use of cover crops. Many of the long-term benefits of cover crops are well known, but it can be difficult to put a dollar amount on some of these long-term benefits. One of these in particular is the economic return with utilizing cover crops as an additional forage source. Area ISU Extension and Outreach beef specialists and field agronomists received many questions from producers who were interested in utilizing annual forages and wanted some good research-based information to help them make decisions on different annual forage species, yield potential, nutritional values, and economics. With these factors in mind, this research and demonstration project was designed to give producers some answers to their questions. A team of ISU Extension and Outreach beef specialists and field agronomists applied for a grant through the Iowa Nutrient Research Center to do a project to learn more about the use of annual forages and to help provide producers with research-based information to answer their questions. These are the team members involved, and you'll be hearing from the different beef and agronomy specialists throughout today's field day. There were three main objectives or goals for this research project. The first objective was to compare the yield and nutritional values of different forage species. The second was to determine the nutrient removal rates of the different forage species. And third, we wanted to do a better job educating producers using current research-based information. One key aspect of this research and demonstration project was looking at incorporating or integrating annual forages on the farm. As you can see, there are several areas where annual forages might be able to fill in the gaps when grazing may be limited. This is especially true when we look at how cool season annuals can extend some grazing opportunities in the beginning and at the end of both pastures and row crop production. We can also see how warm season annuals can fill in the gap during the warm season months when cool season annuals and pastures have very limited production. As you can see in this project timeline, cool season annuals are planted in early fall for the previous year's research. These cool season annuals are later harvested during the following spring. Shortly after harvest, warm season annuals are then planted and harvested according to the maturities during the summer months, after which the next round of cool season annuals are planted again in early fall. We would like to thank those who helped fund and support this important research project, especially the Iowa Nutrient Research Center, the Southern Iowa Forage and Livestock Committee, Behrenberg Seeds, and Milburn Seeds, as well as the staff from the research and demonstration farms for their continued assistance throughout this project. As a result of this funding, support, and assistance, we have been able to complete 2 years of research on both cool season and warm season annual forage species. Today, however, we'll just be focusing on cool season annual forage species. So now let's hear from Aaron and Chris to learn more about this research project and how it was set up.
Hi, I'm Aaron Soigling, Extension Field Agronomist in Southwest Iowa.
Hello, I'm Chris Clark, Beef Specialist in South Central Iowa.
We want to talk a little bit about the species that you see here today, kind of the methods that we use to develop this treatment and this plot. And so what we're looking at is there's 5 separate small grain species that we seeded in the fall, late September here by Sheridan, Iowa. And there's 2 plots for each species. One has 50 pounds of urea nitrogen applied this spring to hopefully increase our yield for tonnage. The species that we're looking at today are going to include barley. Barley was chosen because it's often revered as a very good quality for cattle feed, but you'll see in our plots we just lack a lot of growth. Winter is extremely difficult this far south in Iowa for barley to be a real success for it to overwinter. The next species we choose is rye grain, and one thing we like about rye is that it's readily available. The species we look at is a variety not stated. There's specific varieties that you can choose from, but we choose a VNS because it's probably cost effective. The next one we see is triticale, and that's the plot that I'm standing in now. This is a cross between winter wheat and rye, so hopefully it gives us the blend of both worlds in terms of yield as well as quality.
Our fourth and fifth species utilized in the trial are two varieties of winter wheat. First is the standard hard red winter wheat that most producers have probably used in the past if they have seeded wheat. Hard red winter wheat isn't quite as hardy as cereal rye, but is one of the more hardy species, and it tends to mature later than rye in the spring, providing potential for greater yield. The second variety is a Willow Creek forage winter wheat, which is a taller variety of wheat that has been bred for forage production. Its lack of awns or beards make it more palatable, and again, it is later maturing, thus offering the potential for greater yield.
Okay, so let's talk just a moment about the harvest process too. Like Aaron mentioned, we're here filming today on May 13th, and we're probably ready to harvest at least a couple of the different species. We're targeting probably doe to early head stage, trying to get that optimum of yield and quality, trying to somewhat mimic what producers might be after if they're harvesting for silage in the spring, or if they're using this for grazing. And what we do for harvest and sampling here at the McNay farm is they have a small forage harvester, and they'll harvest a strip right down the center of each plot. That harvester will weigh the samples, and then of course we can do the math and calculate that yield per acre. And we can also take samples to the forage dryer, and we'll dry it and then do dry weights and do the math and kind of compare to get moisture and dry matter content. We'll also do representative samples and pool together multiple small samples. The small plot size works nice to allow that sampling. And then we submit those to a commercial laboratory for nutritional analysis to get crude protein and some basic energy calculations and some mineral content and things like that. So we're hoping to kind of use this to establish what we can expect in terms of both yield and quality for these species to be used for forage for cattle production.
So let's take a look at what we've learned so far from this project regarding forage yields and forage quality with these different cool season species. Discussing this section is myself, Rebecca Vidito, and I am an extension field agronomist in East Central Iowa. And also helping to discuss this section will be Erica Lundy, who is a beef specialist in Southwest Iowa.
So just a quick recap of our species that we're using in this trial. So Aaron and Chris did a great job of explaining this earlier, but we're just going to do a quick recap to refresh your memory. So our first species was cereal rye, and that was chosen basically because it's kind of the gold standard when we talk about cover crops. Barley is another species that we've seen some questions from producers in the area. So typically barley would be planted in the early spring with the intent to be harvested as a hay or silage crop prior to another crop. Our third species was triticale, and this is just a cross between winter wheat and cereal rye. And so this kind of brings us the best of both worlds between the hardiness of rye and a little bit higher forage quality to our wheat variety. Hard red winter wheat would be our grain wheat variety that we use. This is kind of the standard winter wheat that most producers have used over the years. And then our last species would be our forage winter wheat. And this is a newer hybrid variety that's really been bred to be used for forage production.
And then also with our project, we also looked at nitrogen fertilizer. So we had our plots of the different species, and then we split those plots in half. Half of those plots had no nitrogen, and half of those plots received 50 pounds of nitrogen in the spring. And one of the reasons why we included the nitrogen aspect to this study is we were getting questions from producers as well, asking us, is there much of a benefit for adding nitrogen? What can we maybe expect with that? And so we decided to add nitrogen on top of this. And kind of where we came with that 50 pounds of nitrogen fertilizer is that the research that's been done with the small grain, once we kind of get past that 50 pounds of nitrogen, we see less of a return. So that's one of the reasons why we chose that 50 pounds of nitrogen fertilizer rate.
So this table shows our forage yield across all three of our farms where we have these forage plots set up. So this data would have been planted in the fall of 2019 and then harvested in the spring of 2020. So we did just harvest our species from this spring here recently, but we don't have that data put together yet. And so just to set up our tables real quick, along the left axis there, we can see what our yield looks like in terms of tons per acre on a dry matter basis. And so we also see letters across those bars there that really just kind of designate our statistical difference if it's there or not. So all those letters that have an A would be indication that all of those species are not statistically different from each other, even though we see some numerical differences. So a couple key points we want to point out here is our nitrogen versus no nitrogen response. So those bars in the gray would be our species that had nitrogen applied at 50 pounds per acre. And then our species in the red would be those that did not have any nitrogen applied. So looking at these numbers, we can see about a 53% boost when we applied that 50 pounds of nitrogen. So we see that those species that had the nitrogen, our rye forage wheat, our hard red wheat, and the triticale obviously had a nice response, a little bit better yield potential compared to those species that did not have the nitrogen applied. All of the yields from these 4 species, our rye and our wheat varieties and the triticale, were in that 1 to 2 tons of dry matter per acre, which would be pretty typical what we would expect for cool season species harvested in the spring. Another point we want to kind of point out here is our barley species on the clear right up the graph. So obviously we still saw a boost when we had that nitrogen applied to the barley, but still pretty low yielding variety that we have here. And this is really just kind of indicative of our overwintering capabilities. And really, we didn't have very good luck at 2 of the 3 outlying farms. And so this barley data is actually just from our McNay research farm, the farm that's furthest to the south.
So another piece of data that we wanted to also share that we've learned from this project is kind of just talking about those forage species and also talking about the harvest date. So this data is specifically from our McNay research farm, which would be more south central Iowa. And as Erica pointed out on the previous graph, that if we look at that y-axis, that's showing us the yield in tons of dry matter per acre. And then again, those different letters above the bar graph are showing if there's a statistical difference. So if they have a different letter, there's a statistical difference than if they have the same letter. So one of the things that we did different at the McNay farm is that we specifically harvested those forage species based on when they were their individual species maturity. So our goal was to try and harvest those species when they reached the soft dough stage or when that seed head was just starting to emerge. And so rather than focusing on the yields here, we want you to focus on the harvest dates and when those species were reaching that desired maturity. So this can kind of help you think more bigger picture as far as when we're thinking about those different species, how they might fit into your farming operation or with your goals. So if we look at the rye and the barley, those reach maturity first. So rye is the most cold tolerant of these species. And so it comes out of dormancy quicker in the spring for grazing, and it's also going to reach maturity sooner from a harvesting perspective. Keep in mind that when we look at the triticale is a hybrid of rye and the winter wheat. So it's again designed to have the best of both worlds. So it makes sense that it was ready for harvest between the rye and the wheat. And then our last species that reached maturity or that timing of when we were ready to harvest them were our 2 different wheat varieties that we had. And if we specifically look at that forage wheat variety, it's designed to be later maturing. So we have longer time before that seed head appears. And so it gives us more time to have maximize kind of that leaf area, and it gives us a little bit more flexibility in terms of grazing as well. So this data can be useful if we know kind of if we think back to our big picture goal with the farming operation. So for example, if a producer wants to come back with a corn or soybean crop after grazing or harvest, we might be thinking or leaning more towards the cereal rye side of things, just since that one is going to be ready to harvest sooner in the spring compared to some of the other species that we looked at here. However, if maybe we're going to go to a warm season annual, or maybe we're going to be seeding a pasture or a hay crop after, we might think more about using one of those wheat varieties. Since they are going to be later maturing, we can maximize that forage production, and then also tie in that other half of the rotation that we want to. So we really need to kind of think about what that big picture goal is, and that can help us decide maybe what species is going to be the best fit for us.
So another big component of this project has been kind of focusing on the forage quality of these different species and how that might fit in comparison to our cool season pastures, and then also what it means in terms of beef cow requirements. So here is a kind of summary of what our forage quality looked like from all of these species. And you can see in our first column here, our dry matter, pretty relatively high moisture feed stuff that we're dealing with. So our dry matter of these 5 cool season species is somewhere in that 16 to about 20% dry matter. So we're looking at about a 80% moisture forage crop here. Our next column would be our crude protein. We can see here that our barley kind of tends to separate itself from the other species. And really, I think this is more just an indication of where that plant was in terms of stage of reproduction compared to the others. In general, though, our 13.5 to this 14.5% crude protein that we see, that would be enough to meet the needs of a lactating beef cow. So for many of us in Iowa, when we would be grazing or harvesting these forage crops in the spring months, it's likely that we'll be using a beef cow that is either near calving or has already calved. And so at this stage of production for that beef animal, these cover crops would be sufficient to meet their crude protein requirements. Our next 2 columns are our acid and neutral detergent fiber, our fiber values. And in general, these are pretty low compared to some of the other forages that we might have available, like our spring pastures this time of year. So it kind of begs the question, do we need some additional fiber dry matter in our diets of those beef cattle? And then our last value here on the right would be our TDN, or our total digestible nutrients, which would be equivalent to the energy values. So again, very high, and these would exceed our beef cow requirements. Here at the bottom, we have added in a pasture column, and this would be samples from Iowa pastures taken in this April-May timeframe when these cool season cover crops would have been sampled. So it's a good comparison of what the forage quality of the cover crops looks like compared to our vegetative cool season pastures. And so in general, our numbers there are pretty consistent between those two, and with maybe our pasture even a little bit lower in terms of the protein and energy content that we might see from our forage species. And really, this is just because our cover crops will often take off and get established a little bit sooner in the year than our pastures would. So real quickly, we just want to touch on a couple potential grazing issues that we might see. So the first one would be that moisture content. So we mentioned a lot of these small grains that we're using in the study are pretty high in moisture content. So it's just kind of something to keep in mind early on in the grazing season. If we are looking at grazing our cover crops, there might be some benefit to providing some type of a supplemental feed to go along with our cover crops, just to make sure that we're getting those nutrients utilized to the best of that animal's ability. Another point to keep in mind is to remember that we see a rapid change once we start to get to that boot stage, where we might start to think about harvesting for silage. And so when we start to send that seed head up, a lot of our nutrients get converted to grain versus being in our leaves. So we see that feed value will drop pretty significantly over a few days. So we really need to be kind of on top of it in terms of trying to dictate when we want to be grazing or harvesting that crop for a silage. And for some species, there might be some anti-quality issues. For example, if harvested too mature, the awn or the seed head produced by cereal rye and other small grain varieties can potentially cause some mouth sores in cattle. While these aren't very common issues, they can obviously create some cattle health concerns and impact the animal's willingness to consume the cover crop and even other feeds. Something else to keep in mind too, with any type of a early green lush forage species, so whether that's pasture or cover crops, is grass tetany concerns. So again, something that's not very common, but it is something that we've seen a couple cases of. So we want to make sure that producers are aware of that.
And then another potential issue that we can sometimes see is nitrate toxicity. And this is especially more of a concern if we have a field that's been highly fertilized and also if we have had drier conditions. And so with the nitrate toxicity, the only way to really know if it's an issue is to take a forage sample and get it tested. But if we know that it is higher in nitrates, we can manage it by kind of limiting their intake or maybe doing some strip grazing or something like that. Or if we're going to use it more in a silage perspective, diluting it with some other feed. And then the last potential grazing issue we just wanted to touch on here today is if we're grazing in the spring, one of the questions we get is compaction concerns as well, especially if we have a really wet spring. And the best management trying to limit potential compaction issues is if we know that it's going to get wet or if it does turn wet is pulling those cows off that field, so that way we try to minimize any potential compaction issues or roughing up that surface. So with this project, we've been able to collect a lot of really good yield and quality data looking at these different cool season forage species. And hopefully this information that we've been able to collect will be useful for producers as they look at maybe utilizing this in their own farming operation. Another aspect we wanted to touch on though with this project is kind of how does this look from an economic perspective? So we're going to hear from one of our beef specialists, Patrick Wall, who's going to touch a little bit more on the economics side of this.
We want to take a few moments to discuss some of the economic considerations with using annual forages. I'm Patrick Wall, area beef field specialist for Southeast Iowa. The most obvious upfront cost to consider would be seed. In this trial, we tested several different varieties that range in price. Obviously, cereal rye is the most common, and it is also the cheapest and most readily available, roughly $10 to $15 a bushel. Barley, wheat, triticale all range in that $18 to $25 for a 50-pound bag, and the seeding rate can vary as well. The costs associated with barley, wheat, and triticale often tend to be variety specific, which lends to the higher cost per bushel or cost per pound. Cereal rye in many cases is sold as VNS or variety not stated, which helps lower the cost. Another cost consideration would be fertilizer. If yield is your primary goal, we would strongly consider a supplemental nitrogen application. In this trial, we used 50 pounds of urea and saw a noticeable response in yield across all varieties. If you're mechanically harvesting the crop, you need to consider potash and phosphorus. A lot of that will be removed with the crop, so consider putting back what you take off. More crop-specific information on nutrient removal can be found in our document PM 1688. There's not a lot to talk about when in terms of weed management. One of the great things about cover crops is they suppress weeds. There's very little herbicides that you can use while the cover crop is growing. You might, to take care of some broadleaves, maybe use a light dose of 2,4-D. Always consider follow label directions, check each particular herbicide, pesticide, if they can be used in the situation that presents itself. The final cost consideration is obviously equipment, whether you plant this with a no-till drill, aerial seed costs, all of those are variable. A lot of it depends on what you have access to at the time. If you're going to mechanically harvest, mowing with a conditioner, raking to flip that forage over to help dry it out, and then chopping, we would strongly encourage you to work this process backwards. If you have access to a chopper, obviously this is much easier, but if you're using a custom chopper, make sure you schedule that person first before you knock the crop down and get it raked and ready to be put in a bale. If you're going to use baleage, you want to wrap that crop within 24 hours of baling it. So make sure that your access to a wrapper happens at the same time when the crop is harvested. If you're considering grazing this crop rather than mechanical harvest, the obvious things come to mind: fencing, water, supplemental feed. This crop is extremely wet if you graze it in the fall or early spring. So you might consider some really dry forage like either CRP hay or even corn stalks to help slow down the wet feed that's going through the cows in a grazing situation. Other basic cost considerations with annual forages is they are risky. There's not always a guarantee of optimal yield. We always say seeding date in the fall, the earlier the better. If you can get it in a day earlier in the fall, sometimes that can gain you almost a week's worth of growth in the spring. Other additional resources and economic considerations can be found on the Ag Decision Maker website.
And just to wrap up, we want to go over the key takeaways that we've learned from this project. One of the key takeaways is it's really important for producers to really look at and define what are your farming goals. And if you are looking at using annual forages, kind of thinking at that bigger picture is how you might incorporate them into your operation. From species selection, in this specific project, we looked at 5 different species. And with this species that we looked at, some of the takeaways that we learned from these is that while we get a lot of questions on barley and the potential barley has, at least from the project that we've done here, barley, it does not overwinter the best. And so we're pretty limited on the yield compared to some of our other forage species. Well, rye has traditionally kind of been the gold standard for cover crop species, depending upon the goals of your operation. If you're in a corn soybean rotation, it's probably still going to be one of your better species to think about. But if you're really wanting to maximize that forage production, the forage wheat looks very promising. And then from a nitrogen perspective, well, the nitrogen does add to the cost. If we really want to maximize that forage production, we might consider doing some nitrogen fertilization.
So we've talked a little bit about the quality of these cool season cover crops, and in general are very high quality forages, and they often have the potential to exceed beef cow requirements. So they fit nicely into our grazing system and to really can help meet those needs of those animals at maybe a time where we don't necessarily have a forage that's available. So far, we have harvested 2 crops of these cool season species, and our goal moving forward is to continue doing some of this forage plot research for the next 2 years, but we're looking at changing up our species a little bit to get a little bit better questions on some of the species that we've heard from producers. Additionally, with these forage research plots that we have going on, we've also incorporated 5 species of warm season forages to really evaluate the potential for our annual forage production. So plan to stay tuned for more information on the project as we progress throughout the next few years. Later this summer, we also plan to share some more information about the warm season annuals and that data that we have found.